When did you first acquire an interest in dyslexia?
I was an undergraduate student at the University of London studying physiology because I was interested in how the body works, but primarily how the brain worked. And I was not interested in being involved in animal work, which is what many physiologists do, to study animal models of human function and human disease. And I really was looking for a graduate project that involved perhaps children and childhood-based disorders. And so as I looked around at graduate programs, I found a lab in Oxford that was studying dyslexia, and I was drawn to that. And once you enter into the field in that way, you quickly recognize that perhaps your interest, there may have been something else in the back of your mind that attracted you to that also, because I quickly recognized that there were people around me who have dyslexia, there are people around in my family who are struggling learners, and so it was a good fit. And I was lucky that during my graduate work I actually worked in a research lab at Oxford, but I also spent a lot of time in America with people who are clinicians, and I was lucky in my graduate work that I spent time both in a lab in England that was doing basic research, but also with investigators here in America who came at the subject matter from a more clinical perspective and a more applied perspective.
Your doctoral work was done in England, but yet you mentioned America. Can you tell me how that transition occurred? Eventually we were able to keep you here in America, and so I'm just interested in how that process occurred and unfolded.
Right. So when whilst I was doing my PhD in England, I wanted to come to a conference here in America. It was a conference that was run by Richard Olson in Colorado, and it was the Verdun Remediation Conference, and I'd heard about it and I wanted to attend, and so I went to my mentor, John Stein, and I said, I'd like to go to this conference. And he said, you can go. I have no money for you, but you can go. And I had met a neurologist from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, many years ago through my parents, because my parents worked in the field of applications used in medicine, and they knew this neurologist. And so I called this neurologist, Dr. McKinney, and I said, Dr. McKinney, I would like to come to America, because he had said to me when I'd met him, kid, if you ever want to come to America, you just call me. And so I did, and Dr. McKinney introduced me to Dr. Wood and Dr. Wood's colleagues, people like Rebecca Felton, Lynn Flowers, and so I had the privilege of coming to Winston-Salem to spend some time in their lab, and I combined that with my trip to the conference in Colorado, and I was not only introduced to their important research, because they are one of two sites at the time that had a longitudinal research project going on in children with dyslexia, but I was also introduced to the International Dyslexia Association, which has a very rich history in North Carolina, and it was the first time that I attended such a meeting, and it was something that I'd never experienced before, quite different from what I had seen in the UK, and something that impressed me deeply, and I ended up coming back often throughout my graduate work, and in the end it drew me to come here for my fellowship. And even though I arrived with one suitcase to do my fellowship at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, I never left, and I accrued quite a lot of stuff since then and have stayed since.
Well, how fortunate for the IDA that connection was made in North Carolina for you. That was wonderful. It's really interesting. What is it about your work that you find the most interesting and also the most challenging?
I'm very lucky that I entered neuroscience at a field where tools have been made available that not only provide great insight and help advance science, but also make neuroscience really fun to be involved in. so I came to America as a postdoctoral fellow to learn how to do brain imaging. And I did that at the National Institutes of Health for 3 years, and then it was time to look for a real job, and I joined the faculty at Georgetown University. And when I was at the NIH, fMRI was new. It was fairly new. People there were in part the researchers who were responsible for making it happen. And the reason it's so important is because it's the first time that we had a brain imaging technology that was non-invasive. That means you could scan anybody, and you could scan children, and you didn't have any concerns about ethics because you weren't exposing anybody to any radiation that was harmful or that you had to limit. So it means you could study younger populations, healthy populations. Until then, kids had been followed developmentally, but often these were children who were receiving a scan to look at their disease. And so, that work was interesting, but it didn't tell you much about the typical developing child. And we could use it for studying things like following children developmentally, studying them before and after intervention, and really it just opened up so many possibilities. And so it was a very exciting time to be at a place where the technology was in part developed and it was being implemented. And we ended up doing the very first fMRI study on dyslexia that was ever published, and that was published in Nature in 1996. Now, so it's a very vibrant field, it's a fun field, it's a field that attracts scientists, and so because I work in this field, I can attract undergraduates and graduate students who want to work with me in this area. And it's nice because it's a very visual way of explaining to people what dyslexia is about, and I think the field in many ways has shown much of what the behavioral research has shown, but given kind of a home in the brain to these functions and these processes and how they differ in dyslexic and non-dyslexic readers. And that's just, makes it very interesting and allows you to connect as a neuroscientist with a variety of people who are interested in dyslexia for different reasons.
I know that you collaborate with other organizations and schools like Gallaudet University. Can you tell us a little bit about how that collaboration is happening right now with you and the research you're doing?
Yes, I think brain imaging brings with it a need for interdisciplinary research, for collaborations, for people with different expertise. Not one person can do this because we all bring different skill sets to the table. So my training is in physiology. I work with Lynn Flowers, who's a neuropsychologist, and we have computer scientists on the team, engineers, people with a wide, with different skills, and we bring them all together to help us problem solve and address the questions that we pose for ourselves. And so that's been one really fun aspect of my work, which is this collaborative nature of the work. I continued my relationship with people at Wake Forest University in that we wrote grants together, got grants funded, and did research studies, one of which involved bringing a group of adults from Winston-Salem to North Carolina. These are adults, many of whom have dyslexia, who were seen by June Orton when they were children. And we refer to them at Georgetown as the flying Ortons, because they were the Ortons, as they're referred to often at Bowman Gray, but we brought them up to Georgetown to be scanned, and they then went back to Winston-Salem, received tutoring, and then came back for another scan so that we could understand what is the brain change that was supporting their reading improvements. I collaborate with Gallaudet University in my studies of understanding reading in people who are deaf, to understand how that kind of sensory experience influences written language representation in the brain. People who are deaf communicate in different ways. Some use American Sign Language, some do not, some use English. That plays a role too in how the brain is organized. And I also have collaborated with Lehigh Tan in Hong Kong and Beijing to ask questions such as, how does the brain deal with reading when you're teaching that child a different orthography? And since reading is not a natural task, and we really force the brain into becoming a reading brain, it's perhaps not surprising that depending on the writing system, the brain makes use of slightly different areas. And using brain imaging, we can ask the question, well, which areas, and how does the beginning Chinese reader look like compared to the beginning American reader?
I remember when some of the results from the work with your collaborators in China, when the results were reported in American newspapers, and you became quite the celebrity at that time. And so you've answered somewhat what attracted you to the International Dyslexia Association. Can you maybe expand a little bit about that, and also elaborate on the many hats you have worn as a leader in IDA?
Mm-hmm. You know, I think I was just drawn to the sense of community that IDA represents. So not only do I remember Frank Wood taking me to a local North Carolina chapter conference, he also drove me by June Walton's house, and you know, I have an interest in history, and it just was a very sort of memorable moment to be in a place where so much of what we do as an organization originated. And I would come to these meetings, and they really are meetings that are very, they stand in stark contrast to the other kinds of meetings that I go to. I'm a neuroscientist. Neuroscientists go to conferences that are large. I often go to a conference called Society for Neuroscience. It's attended by 35,000 neuroscientists. And it's a very different pace than what we have at our conferences, and it's a very different dynamic. And being in a community that brings together people around one topic for very many reasons makes it very attractive and very exciting. So I had never been exposed to a place where people would meet and talk about advocacy, research, intervention. You know, I would meet attorneys whose work evolved around people with dyslexia. That's something that doesn't happen to you in other aspects of science or neuroscience. And so I feel very privileged that I can come to these conferences, have conversations with school teachers, learn what they're doing in the classroom, and I take that knowledge back into the lab and ask research questions based on what I've heard here. And so really it provides a lot of enrichment, and I sort of pity my colleagues who, you know, often do very basic animal models of research who are not part of that kind of a stimulating collaborative environment.
Thinking now about your tenure as president of IDA, I had the good fortune of being on the board at that time, and I was very delighted that you were tackling some of the organizational issues regarding board work and committee work. Can you just share a little bit about your goals during your tenure and some of the things you wanted to accomplish as president of IDA?
Yes. You know, I joined the board at a time when I felt it was something I could add to my list of responsibilities. And, you know, for the same reasons as I enjoyed the broader IDA community, really enjoyed being on the board. And by the time I became president, it had dawned on me that even though we have a rich history, that we were often backward-looking rather than forward-looking as an organization. And that paired with the rapid change in our economic climate just necessitated a change. And so when I became president-elect in 2008, that was a good year in that I had my first daughter was born five days after becoming president-elect. But it was a very hard year for everybody in the world because of the financial crisis. And that really crystallized things. And I looked at the organization, and some things that may have been obscured before became very clear. And here's what happened. We did several things. I did a few sort of organizational things for the board so that we wouldn't find ourselves burdened by too many committee meetings. I brought in more experts by having people outside of the board serve on those committees. And I also tasked the board itself to think about its own organizational structure. We have many experts. We have many content experts on the board. But a board really has to be strong in terms of setting the goals, understanding governance, and being able to fundraise. And I don't think all of our board members, in fact I would say many of our board members, didn't feel comfortable doing that. I didn't feel comfortable doing that, but through being on the board long enough and looking at other boards, I realized that our board was very different from other organizations, and we really needed to address that gap. And as you know, the nominating process is the one by which people enter the board, but there were some vacancies that were left open after I took over as president, and I immediately used those to bring in people who were from business background. Many of them had dyslexia. Some were from a background that they were very familiar with philanthropy or very familiar with boards and governance. And I think those individuals have done a lot to help educate our board and recognize that we as a board come with many, many different strengths and a variety of strengths. But in the end, we probably need to group those strengths in ways that can be more effective. So I've been arguing for moving forward in a way that we use a smaller board, a board that has more expertise with governance and fundraising, and that we use our content experts in areas that they feel most comfortable, which is to guide us and guide the organization in terms of our activities around research and standards and those kinds of activities.
I know that you did a lot of traveling when you were president, and the Northern Ohio branch, of which I am a member, was fortunate to have you as our keynote speaker. Could you tell us a little bit about your experiences visiting the branches and connecting with the branches during your tenure?
Yes, just this morning, somebody thanked me for coming to speak at their branch, and this is something that happens to me all the time when I come to the IDA conferences, that I see people who I've met on my trips, and they're so grateful, and what they don't know is how grateful I am to have the opportunity to go out there, because it's very energizing. Again, I live in a university setting, not a typical laboratory. Our work is much more interesting than that, but it's really very nice to be able to take your work and show it to people who bring such a different viewpoint and experience to it. And again, as I said before, learn from them in terms of some of the burning questions they wonder about, and wonder whether brain research can address that. So that's been very interesting. But of course, the moment I became president, I also began to appreciate those trips in other ways. I wasn't just the scientist coming, but now I was the incoming president or president, and I recognized that the branches, had vary very much, and depending on where they are in the States, depending on what their interests are. So it's very nice to sort of capture these individual characteristics of all of our different branches and see what they're doing, see where their strengths are, also hear about where their problems are, and begin to address those at the level of the board.
I'm wondering how you feel that your work in the field of neuroimagery helped you in your job as president.
I think that's interesting. I'm not a psychologist, although I think psychology might help in running a board. I think a board is a lot about process and interactions, and some people are very good at that. I think, I've had some predecessors who are extremely good at that. I've always been a very strong admirer of Nancy Hennessy, who I think is really very good at process. I do think that one of the things that perhaps prepared me a little bit is that at the university we do have quite a few requirements to sit on committees. And so with that, we are very comfortable with that kind of an environment, decision-making, discussions, those kinds of things in terms of problem solving as a group. And as a group of people who maybe are thinking about a common problem, but all of whom have different backgrounds, because I will serve on committees where there are people from the Department of English and from the Department of Arts, and we all are there to serve in one way or another. I think that's probably been helpful, and I think the other thing that's helped is that everybody who serves on our board is just very dedicated to the cause. I mean, everybody's volunteering, and everybody cares a great deal. And so in the end, if you're there because you are volunteering and you want to make a difference, you're working with a very different group of people, of course, than when it's work. And so that really adds to the nature of the project.
Well, I want to thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us regarding your own history involving your involvement with dyslexia, as well as your wonderful history with this organization. And I want to thank you for your years of commitment, and I'm sure they will continue. It's been a pleasure for me to be on the board with when you were president, and also to be your friend and colleague.
Well, thank you. And likewise, it's a pleasure that you're doing the interview, given our close working relationship and the conferences that we did together. And thank you also for being a sounding board at the times that I needed it. So thank you.